Good evening and welcome to Law Talk, the show that brings current legal events in the news today into your living room for an understanding and appreciation. Tonight, I'm James Barrett, and with Mark Malachowski, we're going to be discussing some current topics in the news. Good evening, Mark. How are you?
Doing fine. How you doing, Jim?
Okay, so I understand that we have some pretty exciting subjects tonight. Why don't you tell me what our first subject is?
Well, the first thing we'd like to bring up is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Well, aren't those the semi-private government mortgage purchase agencies that we've heard so much about in the news lately?
Yeah, Jim, those are what they call GSEs, which are government-supported enterprises. And though they're semi-private, they have certain rights and privileges that other private companies don't have.
And what are some of those rights and privileges?
Well, some of those rights and privileges are they're protected from some restrictive regulations that other banks would have to adhere to. And then also they have a mission that they're given to by the government. They have like a government sanction, and that started in 1992. And Congress gave them a mission to support affordable housing by giving out subprime loans. In other words, giving out loans to people who otherwise wouldn't qualify for a loan.
Let me ask you a question on this. You mentioned a bank. Are Freddie and Fannie Mae considered banks?
Well, it's an interesting way of looking at it, but not exactly, because a bank would have to have 10% of its capital in reserves, right? In other words, they could make a bet on 10 to 1. They could leverage 10 to 1, whereas a GSE here only has to have 2.5% in reserve, so they can leverage 40 to 1.
Well, wait a minute. Doesn't that give them a great advantage in the loan market to be able to handle more loans at an easier rate?
Yeah, a private company can't really compete against a subsidized company in that market.
Okay, I understand that on top of that, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae aren't even regulated by the SEC, which puts them in a completely superior position as far as their bookkeeping, basically.
Well, they do have some advantages. Also, they're allowed to buy risky loans and accept low down payments, and they don't have the same requirements looking at good credit, like say a 25% down that a private bank would ask for, and don't have to worry so much about ability to pay. In fact, they're able to accept some self-declared loan applications.
Well, this is what we've heard a lot about in the news about doing a no document loan. Is that correct, Mark?
Yeah, no doc loan, and also what happened here, there was also interest-only loans. So coupled with self-declared incomes and interest-only loans, people were able to get into loans much larger than they otherwise would able to get into.
Well, I'd like to bring up something that how this all originated very briefly. I understand that Fannie Mae was originated in 1930 as a way to provide more affordable housing originally, and that through the decades it's actually grown into the entity you're describing today, including I understand that in 1970 Freddie Mac was originated to allow effectively a competitor to Fannie Mae. But then, in fact, because they are both GSEs, they've actually marched to the same drummer.
And also, it's interesting that they also have missions given to them by Congress. If you're a bank, you're responsible to your shareholders. You're supposed to show a profit. You're supposed to give dividends. You have to show your earnings, and so that's your goal. That's your mission. Whereas Congress is saying, well, your mission is to provide affordable housing, so it's not necessarily profit-driven.
But Mark, who pays for this?
Well, the U.S. taxpayer ends up paying for that. In the 1980s, we had 27 million subprime loans, okay, between Fannie and Freddie Mac, the FHA, housing, Federal Housing Association, Community Investment Act, Department of Housing and Urban Development. We had 19 million subprime loans, and those are all guaranteed by U.S. taxpayer. And then we had about 8 million private loans, which would be guaranteed by investors who are playing with their own money.
Well, I understand because of their what effectively is an unfair competitive advantage, both Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have been able to purchase subprime loans from the regular standard bank mortgage loan companies, correct?
Yes, and then when it comes down to it, when you start looking at overall, almost 90% of mortgages are guaranteed in some way by the federal government. In other words, the U.S. taxpayer is on the hook for almost 90% of mortgages.
Yeah, but we've covered this in a prior show, but to reiterate, it seems as though that when you have a guaranteed payer in a bad debt, in this case the U.S. government, ultimately the U.S. taxpayer, that banks can actually be more cavalier about how they handle loans and actually give loans to people that would never qualify originally for that loan.
Well, not only that, but there were some government incentives or requirements that they actually give out a certain percentage of subprime loans.
I understand that happened in the late 90s when there was actually a very specific mandate that banks were even required to stretch to the limits of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and provide the lower risk, the higher risk loans to those individuals that are unable to borrow.
So you had a combination of incentives and requirements forcing the banks to do, and of course I don't know if all of them resisted because they were making money on this, of course, because they make money with fees and for every loan they make and also for servicing the loan over its life. So the banks are making money. But there was also other artificial things that propped up these the value of these homes. There was the home buyer's tax credit, which arguably is a forgiveness for the income due to interest, right? Income tax on interest. We're not going to get into that. There's also a low interest rate. The Fed couldn't adjust interest rates, and also there's these GSAs, these government-supported enterprises. So all these things kind of artificially prop up the home market and gave us prices that tended to bubble.
Okay, and that bubble is kind of what we've witnessed now in the last 3 to 4 years, where the value of the homes kept being pushed up because people that would have normally not been able to borrow to purchase a home were given effectively a free pass to have a stated income and then buy a home for more money than they could ever afford to actually pay.
Well, and the declared income, it turned out a lot of the declared incomes weren't accurate. And so what you had from the period from 1998 to 2006, sometimes you had a 19.2% increase per year in home values.
Yeah, but that increase in home value wasn't supported by actual value because you still had builders building more and more homes, which meant that you still had, if you look at economy to scale, you look at supply and demand, all the standard economic basis for any type of industry. When you have more homes being built, and you have people that are unqualified to pay for those homes, that are actually buying those homes, then they start to default because they've never been able to actually pay for the home. Now you have a supply of homes, new homes. You may have a supply of used homes, and now you have people that aren't paying for them to begin with. Isn't that what this whole concept of the bubble actually, when it burst in 2006 or so, is driven by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae?
Well, I think they're a part of it. There is, like I said, that's about 19 million out of the 27 million. So, roughly 2/3 was driven by that. The other 8 million was in private. So maybe 2/3 of it was driven by Freddie Mac. But like I said, you had these other artificial props that the government put in place to try to get people into the home market. But what's interesting about this is that then when you get a glut of foreclosures, the banks aren't marking the value of the properties on their books as mark to market. They're saying that they have the value of what the loan is. But if and in some cases it's taking 6 months, a year, 2 or 3 years to get people out of the house because the foreclosures, also there's been snafus with doing the foreclosures because there's not enough people around who know how to do them correctly available to do all these foreclosures. So we've got a lot of banks carrying amounts on the books that aren't necessarily what they may turn out to be later. So really, a lot of people are looking at it and saying, even now, we may be looking at a 25% overpriced right now for what people are seeing in the real estate market.
Well, I'm going to tell you, Mark, this subject is, once again, we cross a scary subject. But it does appear there was some form of social engineering that was going on as a result of these incentives provided to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the continuing support of a government that would give money to back people that have no ability to pay for those homes.
Well, we don't really know right now what the liability is. People are estimating in, a couple, 300 billion, maybe more liability in there. Really, we don't know how things are going to work out, how many people are going to be able to keep their homes. What they do know is when they do the loan modifications, a lot of the people that they're hoping would be able to qualify for the loan modifications and keep their home and maybe adjust their payments or adjust some of that numbers there. That's not really working as well as they hoped.
Okay, well, I think what we need to do is I think this is another subject that needs to be revisited, because we're still waiting to see how this is going to pan out if and when the interest rate rises. So what's our next subject for the night, Mark?
Okay, well, we want to talk about the General Welfare Clause.
And what is the General Welfare Clause?
Well, when the Constitution was written, Madison was one of the framers of the Constitution, one of the principal writers, and they put together a list of things that the Congress has the power to do. And this is very important because the power of the federal government, the police power of the federal government, whatever power the federal government takes, that power can't go to the states or to the individual. And the Constitution pretty much being a contract between the federal government, the states, and the individual. And when you're saying which powers the Congress has, if Congress gets the powers, it's naturally detracted or infringed upon the power of the state or the individual.
Well, I understand in 1787, from all historical reports, the summer in Philadelphia was scorching hot, very humid. And I know they worked hard on that Constitution. And when you talk about general welfare, aren't you talking about Article 1, Section 8, that states what the enumerated powers of Congress actually are?
Right. And what Article 1, Legislative Branch, Section 8, Powers of the Congress, actually says is the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. And
but wait a minute, are those enumerated powers or just the preamble to the enumerated powers?
Well, Madison, who was one of the writers of the Constitution, considered that a preamble, and he said that the following enumerated powers should be narrowly interpreted, a narrow construction, and anything the Congress does should be at least tangentially tied to an enumerated power. An example of an enumerated power would be to borrow money on the credit of the United States. That would be a domestic power. And there's roughly about 8 domestic powers, talking about, post office, bankruptcy, the patent office, commerce, and that kind of thing, coining money, stopping counterfeiters, and then the courts. The courts are the Supreme Court, and then you have about 8 powers about war and stopping insurrections. But they're all pretty definitive and specific, and they talk about, you can tax and spend for these purposes.
But I understand right from the very beginning there was an argument about what the Congress's power actually was. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton contested those powers immediately after ratification of the Constitution.
Well, I think the timing is key, because after ratification, Hamilton said that, we should use a broad interpretation of those enumerated powers, and the preamble, which I just read, should be considered an enumerated power in itself. And if you look at the English of it, it's an interesting construction, because you have a preamble and then it has a semicolon, and then you have all the enumerated powers after that. And really, on that semicolon hangs the balance of the power between the federal and the states and the individual.
Well, I understand with the preamble, though, as we review the preamble actually generally covers everything that is in the enumerated powers.
Right. And so
that follow.
That's true. The preamble basically looks at the 16 other enumerated powers and gives a broad introduction. But Hamilton argued that the preamble in itself is an enumerated power, and because it says you can provide for the general welfare, that Congress in the general welfare is a pretty broad term, that Congress has huge powers.
But wait a minute, if you're looking at the preamble as an enumerated power, and it covers this vast expanse, doesn't that open the door for the Congress to take power that wasn't ever really interpreted or written under the original Constitution?
Well, the first thing it does is it actually eviscerates or negates the actual enumerated powers. Because if it's broadly to provide for the common defense and broadly to the general welfare, why should you have to obey the specific enumerated clauses? So first, in just terms of the English, interpretation of the document, it wipes out your enumerated power doctrine. And so, but prior to 1936, the narrow construction that Madison favored, who was one of the writers, that was favored. That was held. But around 1935 to 1937, there was a huge change in our country.
Well, I understand what instigated most of this change was the enactment of the Social Security Act.
Yeah, of 1935.
And what happened following that, there was a case called Halvorine versus Davis, where the Supreme Court actually articulated a broader power granted to Congress. And what they actually did was they said that Congress doesn't have to live by the enumerated powers. They'll do that anyway. But they have the ability to create and establish what they believe are enumerated powers, which greatly expands the entire interpretation of the Constitution.
Well, there's an interesting twist on that. The Halvorson versus Davis, 1937, was looking at the Social Security Act, and they were saying the old age provisions, in other words, that people reach a certain age to get a government check monthly,
right,
is unconstitutional, because they're saying, why should there be a tax on young people to pay to support old people? That's unconstitutional. And so in that case, really what you're talking about, they said, well, Congress decides what's in the general welfare clause. But there's a little backstory to that, is that FDR in 1937 threatened to add 6 justices to the 9-justice Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court responded by basically folding.
Well, let me add to that. What happened was that at the time that Roosevelt made that statement, he said that because there was 6 justices on the Supreme Court, there were over 70, that he wanted to put 6 more justices to help those 6 justices, that were over 70. What then would have increased the size of the Supreme Court from 9 to 15. And then, following that statement by the president, remarkably, the decision in the Halvorson-Davis case came down, which allowed Congress to now effectively create what they believe were enumerated powers.
So if you look at the Constitution as like a contract, and then you had one party, exerting duress on another party, in a contract law, that would pretty much
be unconscionable.
That would invalidate that clause,
contract,
clause or the thing. So Halvorson and Davis, and possibly revisit it sometime and look at, well, what degree of this duress, the threat of the 9 justices, affect that decision, as far as the executive against the Supreme Court or the judicial system.
Well, Mark, what do you think? Do you think that levied some power on the Supreme Court to influence that decision in the Davis case?
Well, I wasn't there, but I would say that even today we have issues that are coming up that go to the general welfare clause. Okay, on Obamacare, we have a situation where states who don't go along with Obamacare would lose 100% of their Medicaid funding from the federal government. And Medicaid, there's $250 billion a year spent on that. And states average 18% of all state revenues go to Medicaid. So this is a huge punishment to a state if they don't go along with Obamacare. And prior to that, we have the Dole, 1987, which talked about the drinking age. And it says if you don't raise the drinking age, say, from 18 to 21, you won't get federal highway funding. But in that case, federal highway funding was only about 5% of the total funding.
Well, I got to tell you, Mark, going from Roosevelt to today, it sounds like there's still an extortion being played on this concept of what the interpretation of the general welfare and what they're going to impose on the states and the populace. So with that, I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to leave it to the fact that the general welfare clause under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution may still be in flux and may still be in future interpretation. So what is our last subject tonight, Mark?
Well, our last subject is Billy the Kid.
Are you talking about the Billy the Kid, the outlaw?
Well, actually, there's a great controversy whether he was an outlaw or not. As a matter of fact, the Hispanics in New Mexico at the time Billy the Kid was around thought of him as kind of a folk hero, and he was like fending off big ranchers that were coming in, taking Hispanics' land and water and pushing them around, and he stood up for kind of almost a Robin Hood in those days for some people.
Well, I've always understood Billy the Kid, they talk about that he actually was a gunslinger and that he'd shot 21 people and that somehow or another he escaped from jail on multiple occasions, and on the last occasion he shot 2 deputies. And this whole story about what a bad guy he was. But you're telling me there's a different side of this story.
Well, Governor Richardson of New Mexico, before he left office, was considering pardoning Billy the Kid. And the reason is that Billy the Kid testified against the Jesse Evans gang, who actually shot a one-armed lawyer.
A one-armed lawyer?
And
what?
then
Are you telling me there was lawyers that were out there doing business in the Wild West?
One-armed lawyer. He shot a one-armed lawyer and then set him on fire. And so it was rough in those days if you lost the case. But anyway, the lawyer was Houston Chapman, and he was representing the wife of a fellow who was killed in the Lincoln County War.
I understand the Lincoln County War was a war between competing merchants. There were 2 large cattle baron merchants, and what had happened is they both hired a series of gunmen and wranglers or whatever at the time to fight each other. And there was a lot of innocent people that died during that.
I think they called those people deputies and regulators.
Oh, in those days they called them deputies.
Yeah, regulators.
Regulators.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, but they had competing regulators or competing deputies or sheriffs, and kind of, I guess, 2 people vying to be mayor or whatever it was. And the governor at that time in New Mexico was the Governor Wallace, and he said he would exempt from prosecution Billy the Kid if he would testify about the slaying of this one-armed lawyer.
But before we get to that, can I bring up the story to finish the Lincoln County War? Wasn't that settled in a truce in a bar?
Well, there was a truce to settle Lincoln County War, and they were celebrating the truce, by drinking in a saloon.
Right.
And during that situation, some of the Evans gang, and I'm not sure where they fit in the Lincoln County War because there were several gangs involved, ended up shooting the one-armed lawyer. And since Billy the Kid was the only sober one in the saloon at that time, he was the only one who could testify in court. And he did agree, and he did testify against the Evans gang.
I understand the territorial governor, they actually even did a little acting here where they had him arrested for a crime, a minor crime, and they brought him to testify. And he did testify according to the deal that he understood by the territorial governor. But then the governor decided that he was going to sentence him for all his past crime. And then they went forward from that, and he wasn't going to be released. And that's when he escaped from custody.
Well, the governor apparently played a little trick on Billy the Kid. He arrested him, and Billy the Kid thought that after some
minor period of
time, he would be let loose. And then the governor made some kind of statement, well, the Billy Kid's not the guy that you necessarily have to worry about public opinion if you don't keep a deal with. And with that, when I think Bill had heard about that, he arranged to help. Someone apparently helped him escape. He shot 2 of Pat Garrett's deputies during his escape, and made a getaway.
Well, that brings Pat Garrett into the story. We all have an illusion of this romantic illusion of this detective, police agent, sheriff named Pat Garrett that went out with a posse looking for Billy the Kid with honest heart and honest intent to bring in a bad guy. But is there more to that story?
Well, it is kind of interesting because Pat Garrett was hired to track down rustlers. And pardon or no pardon, Billy the Kid apparently earned a lot of his money being a rustler. So there's necessarily a conflict there.
Okay, so what it effectively is, he had an excuse to hunt him down anyway, let alone the broken promise of the territorial governor. But on top of the 2 murders, the two deputies that were shot, obviously Pat Garrett, they were friends of his, I understand. So he had a purpose to hunt down Billy the Kid anyway. Now, was that a dead or alive type of apprehension, or what happened?
Well, that's how it turned out. There's some competing stories of when they finally tracked Billy the Kid down, whether he just happened to walk in a room where Pat Garrett was questioning someone else or interviewing someone, and then there was a shootout. Or there's an alternate story where he kind of came into the kitchen to get something to eat, maybe had a knife in his hand, and out of the shadows, Pat Garrett shot him. So there's 2 stories. Nobody really knows what happened, but Billy the Kid ended up dead.
Well, I understand this. This circles back to the Bill Richardson, the governor of New Mexico, and his consideration of the pardon. The main opponents to the pardon turned out to be the grandchildren of Pat Garrett because they didn't want to disrupt the story that had gone on all this time about what Pat Garrett did to hunt down the famous Billy the Kid. So in reality, the Pat Garrett story lives on because Governor Richardson would prefer to stay with the romantic vision of Billy the Kid. Is that an interpretation you have, Mark? Or?
Well, the Pat Garrett's descendants were concerned that it would be looked like a personal vendetta instead of he was doing his job as a deputy or as a sheriff. And also there's competing or conflicting reports of whether Billy really did kill 20 people, and he really was that bad of a guy. So, and also I think it's hard to get witnesses. It's hard to track those things down in those days. A lot of people ended up dead, so you didn't have any witnesses. There's kind of two sides of this story, but in the end, I think the governor decided to err on the side of caution and let Billy kind of live in infamy.
Yeah, but here's the thing, and the reason I bring up this Pat Garrett, this opposition to the pardon, is the fact that I understand Pat Garrett was instrumental in creating dime novels following his shooting of Billy the Kid. So it would be logical that the story would have to be a little more enhanced. That in fact, possibly that 21 number came after the fact, when all historians that I've read have said maybe he shot 4 to 6 people. And that was over a lifetime as opposed to being a short duration gunslinger that killed all these people. And to Pat Garrett to not have a personal vendetta when 2 of his friends were shot during Billy's escape from the Sumner courthouse is a little bit hard to swallow, to believe that he didn't have a personal vendetta at some level.
Well, I think what really comes down in this case, I mean, there's the Pat Garrett issue, and we'll never know really what happened there. But as far as Governor Wallace, people really, it's pretty established or pretty well believed that he did offer the pardon, and he did renege on that deal, and he thought he could renege on that deal because Billy's reputation was such that the territorial governor wouldn't be have his feet held to the fire for backing off on that promise.
Yeah, and I think there's always a question about whether there was a political motive in this, and it seems as though it would have been good for the governor to say, well, I brought in Billy the Kid. So no matter what his long-term political goals were, to me it seems as though that the governor's reneging on a promise of a pardon probably had some great effect into his future, including the potential backing of the merchant that won the Lincoln County War. And on that note, I'd like to bring our night's discussion to an end, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. And for the next evening, Mark Malachowski and myself will join you for more legal issues brought to you in your living room. Thank you very much.